It's funny how something small can turn into a full-blown neighborhood drama. And for me, it wasn't a stolen driveway or a misplaced parking spot this time. It was a fence. A fence that appeared out of nowhere, right on my property, like it had sprouted overnight while I was sleeping. I came home one Saturday afternoon, dragging groceries in, humming along to the radio, ready to enjoy a quiet weekend. And there it was, a tall, perfectly straight, intimidating wooden fence cutting across the corner of my backyard. My initial thought was maybe I was seeing things, that I had mismeasured or misremembered the boundary. But no, it was real, every board in place, every post solid, and the kicker was the smug little note tacked to it, our new fence. Hope you like it. I stared at that note for a long time, gripping the handle of my shopping bag like it was a weapon, wondering if I'd lost my mind or if this was some twisted joke. And then I saw their lawn, the Wilsons, a few doors down, grinning like they had pulled off the heist of the century. And for a moment, just a heartbeat, I debated going over, waving my arms, yelling at them like a maniac. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. It would just make me the angry neighbor, the cautionary tale for the entire block. No, if I was going to handle this, I had to think bigger, smarter, and, most importantly, creatively. So I went inside, dropped the groceries on the counter, and started pacing. I pulled out the survey I had kept from when I bought the house years ago, running my finger along the property lines, confirming every measurement, every corner. Sure enough, the fence was at least 3 feet onto my property. And that's when it hit me. I could either call it in to the city, hire lawyers, drag everyone into months of bureaucracy, or I could do something that would be immediate, visible, and, frankly, unforgettable. And as my mind wandered, a slow grin formed on my face, the kind of grin you get when a plan that's a little mischievous and a little brilliant starts to take shape. I started with reconnaissance, of course, observing the Wilsons like a strategist in a war room. I watched their routines, noticed when they watered the lawn, when the kids ran around, when Mr. Wilson started his weekend barbecues. Every detail mattered, because this wasn't about destruction, it was about turning their backyard into something useless, harmless, but undeniable, a lesson they wouldn't forget. And as I sketched ideas on a notepad, flower beds in awkward places, stepping stones that led nowhere, little decorative obstacles that were technically legal but annoying, I felt that familiar excitement, the same rush I had felt years ago when defending a driveway from a rogue neighbor. The first step was subtlety. I planted a row of potted plants along the edge closest to my property line, spaced just right, so that when they tried to move their lawn furniture, they would constantly bump into them. I positioned rocks strategically, creating a natural maze for anyone trying to use that side of the yard. It was ridiculous, I know, but I loved it. The beauty of it was in the execution, the precision, the way it forced them to adapt, to notice, to finally realize that something had changed in their perfectly curated lawn paradise. Of course, I had to test it. The first time Mrs. Wilson stepped out, carrying a tray of drinks, she tried to move a lounge chair and immediately tripped over one of the potted plants I had so innocently placed. She looked at me through the window, confused and a little irritated, and I could see it dawning on her that the layout of their backyard had subtly shifted. And that's when I knew I was on the right track, that this wasn't just about revenge, it was about a statement. A playful, harmless, absolutely memorable statement. Over the next couple of days, I refined the layout. I added a small section of stepping stones that led directly into a cluster of ornamental bushes, a tiny sandbox that blocked what used to be the prime spot for their grill, and even a decorative scarecrow positioned to supervise the yard. Each addition was carefully thought out to maintain legality, avoid destruction, and maximize mild inconvenience. And the more I adjusted, the more I started to see the subtle psychological effect. Mr. Wilson kept glancing at the yard suspiciously, trying to calculate why every attempt to arrange furniture or set up a lounge chair seemed slightly off. I could almost hear him thinking, "This doesn't make sense. What's different?" Meanwhile, my kids were having the time of their lives, helping me move small items, laughing quietly, imagining us as heroes in some epic backyard saga. And the neighbors started noticing too. Old Mrs. Patel waved from across the street, shaking her head and laughing, while Mr. Sanchez leaned over the fence, whispering, "They're in for a surprise." The thrill wasn't just in the setup, it was in the anticipation, The quiet satisfaction of knowing that the Wilsons were about to discover, all at once, that their perfect backyard had been subtly sabotaged in the most polite, imaginative way possible. And then came the day of revelation. I was sitting on my porch, sipping my coffee, watching as Mr. Wilson carried his grill across the yard, adjusting for what should have been the usual layout, and then stopped dead in his tracks. He backed up, circled around, tried again, muttering to himself, and I swear, the universe paused for a second. He couldn't figure it out. Every move he made was thwarted by my harmless obstacles, every attempt to restore order met with another subtle challenge. And I leaned back, trying not to laugh out loud, savoring the moment, the perfect blend of justice and comedy, of creativity meeting arrogance. Mrs. Wilson came out next, frowning, adjusting the patio umbrella, trying to make sense of why nothing seemed to fit anymore. "Did you do this?" she finally asked, eyes narrowing, and I simply shrugged innocently, waving as though I had no idea what she was talking about. And that's when it hit me, the beauty of subtlety. I didn't have to confront them directly. I didn't need to yell or threaten. The yard itself, carefully redesigned, spoke louder than any words could. The lesson was delivered in a quiet, clever, undeniable way. By the end of that week, the Wilsons had stopped attempting to reclaim that corner of the yard. They moved their furniture, shifted their plans, and eventually accepted that the space, at least for the moment, was effectively useless. And I sat back on my porch, exhausted but triumphant, realizing something important. Justice doesn't always have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to involve confrontation or anger. Sometimes, the quiet, creative solution, delivered with a little humor, a little patience, and a lot of planning, is far more satisfying. And as I watched my kids run around the backyard, giggling, and the neighbors smirk knowingly from across the street, I knew this story wasn't just about a fence or a property line. It was about respect, boundaries, and the quiet satisfaction of doing the right thing in a way that leaves a mark without causing harm. The next few days felt like a mix of strategy and anticipation, almost like I had become the general of a tiny backyard war. Every morning, I'd step outside with coffee in hand and inspect the setup, checking if the plants had shifted, if the stepping stones were still in place, if the sandbox had held its position. And every time I did, I couldn't help but grin because it wasn't just about blocking space. It was about asserting boundaries in a way that was subtle, clever, and absolutely unforgettable. Mr. Wilson, bless him, he didn't take long to notice. The first clue was when he tried to wheel the grill over to what used to be the prime corner. He froze, backed up, circled around, muttering under his breath, and for a moment, it looked like he was questioning his entire life choices. Why? Won't this fit?" He kept whispering, pacing the yard, measuring distances with his eyes, and I could see Mrs. Wilson peeking out from the kitchen window, probably sensing my silent presence. It was beautiful in a ridiculous, almost cinematic way, like watching a sitcom unfold in real life. I started noticing patterns in their frustration. Mr. Wilson tried moving the patio chairs, only to be blocked by a cleverly positioned potted plant. He attempted to set up the kids' play set, only to find the stepping stones perfectly obstructing the path. Every action he took was subtly foiled, and the brilliance of it was in the harmlessness. Nothing was damaged, nothing permanent was done, yet he could feel the boundaries, could sense that the land was being claimed back, one small, calculated obstacle at a time. I even had my kids join in, not in a let's sabotage the neighbors way, but as little helpers, placing tiny flags, moving decorative items, and laughing quietly every time Mr. Wilson paused, scratching his head, or tried to adjust something and realized it wouldn't work. Their laughter was infectious, and I realized that part of the magic was the collaboration. It wasn't just me against them. It was a community performance, a playful yet pointed assertion of rights without a single raised voice. The real turning point came one sunny afternoon. I was on my porch, binoculars in hand for dramatic effect, and I noticed Mr. Wilson trying to organize a small barbecue near the newly useless corner of his backyard. He brought out the grill, the cooler, even a small table, and each attempt was thwarted by the obstacles I had placed. A potted plant toppled over slightly as he tried to maneuver, the sandbox shifted under his weight, and the stepping stones forced him into awkward angles. And I just leaned back, trying not to laugh out loud, imagining him telling this story later. "You wouldn't believe it. The yard had a mind of its own. Mrs. Wilson finally came out, looking at the scene, and asked, "Are you doing this?" I just gave her a slow, innocent smile, sipping my iced tea, pretending to be absorbed in reading a magazine. That's when the lesson landed perfectly. She realized immediately without a word from me that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't natural, and it certainly wasn't random. It was clever, harmless, and undeniable. The yard itself had delivered the message. Over the following week, the Wilsons tried different tactics. They rearranged furniture, tried moving the sandbox, attempted to shift the potted plants, even considered digging into the corner to reclaim the space. And every attempt failed, not because I was mean or vengeful, but because I had thought ahead, anticipating every angle, every possible adjustment they could make. Every misstep was a small, harmless reminder that boundaries exist and that taking someone else's property, no matter how small the slice, has consequences. I began noticing subtle psychological changes. Mr. Wilson started circling the yard slowly, pausing, calculating every move before acting. He would glance at me from his porch, then back at the obstacle-laden corner, clearly aware that the battle wasn't over, but the war had already been lost in his mind. Mrs. Wilson, on the other hand, took a more resigned approach. She adjusted her plans, moving her chairs and play equipment away from the corner, quietly acknowledging that the space was effectively off-limits. It was fascinating to see human behavior in action, the arrogance being tempered by clever planning and subtle but unavoidable consequences. Neighbors started noticing too. Mrs. Patel from across the street waved and chuckled. Mr. Sanchez leaned over to comment on the transformation of the Wilson yard, and my kids would whisper excitedly about how everyone was watching. And that's when I realized something important. The lesson wasn't just for the Wilsons. It was a subtle, shared acknowledgement for the whole street, that boundaries matter, that taking liberties without thought has consequences, and that clever, harmless interventions can be more effective than confrontation. At this point, I refined the setup even further. I added a line of small decorative rocks that formed a natural zigzag path through the corner, placed bird baths that were slightly off-center, and even added a tiny trellis with climbing flowers. Every move was intentional. Every placement calculated to make the corner technically accessible but practically unusable for its original purpose. The genius was in the harmlessness. The yard had become a playful labyrinth, a visual, tangible lesson in respect and strategy. And then came the moment I had been waiting for. Mr. Wilson came out for another barbecue, determined to reclaim the corner, grill in hand, confidence in place, and immediately ran into the obstacles. The zigzag path forced him into awkward angles, the trellis blocked his prime spot, and the bird baths kept him guessing. He muttered under his breath, frustration mounting, and I could see it, the dawning realization that this wasn't just a fluke, this wasn't temporary, this was deliberate, and it had worked perfectly. Mrs. Wilson looked on quietly, eyes narrowed, but with a hint of resignation. She didn't argue, didn't confront me directly, but I could feel the silent acknowledgement. The message had landed. My backyard plan had turned their corner into a perfectly harmless but entirely impractical space, and there was nothing they could do about it without undoing weeks of careful planning. And for me, that was the sweet spot. The victory delivered without conflict, without confrontation, entirely on my terms. By the end of that week, the Wilsons had shifted all of their activities to other parts of their yard, effectively leaving the disputed corner unused. The lesson was absorbed, silently, humorously, undeniably. And as I watched my kids play, neighbors smile knowingly, and the Wilsons adjust to their new limitations, I felt a deep satisfaction, a sense of calm triumph that came from handling a conflict with intelligence, creativity, and patience rather than anger. And it wasn't just about the yard. I realized something about life through this little war. Sometimes, the smallest conflicts, property lines, boundaries, minor annoyances, reveal more about human behavior than the big battles ever could. People's pride, stubbornness, and sense of entitlement become visible in miniature theaters like a backyard. And the clever, quiet solutions, the ones that make a point without escalation, often leave a bigger impact than shouting or confrontation ever could. By the following weekend, things had settled into a strange rhythm. The corner of the Wilsons' yard that had once been perfectly functional was now, for all practical purposes, useless. I would step out onto my porch in the morning with coffee in hand and watch Mr. Wilson cautiously inspect the yard, circling slowly, muttering to himself as if he were trying to decode some complicated puzzle. And for the first time, I realized the power of subtlety. He wasn't angry in a way that could cause confrontation. He was frustrated, cautious, and oddly respectful of the invisible boundary I had established. Mrs. Wilson, on the other hand, seemed to take it more philosophically. She adjusted her furniture, moved the kids' playthings, and quietly accepted that the corner was off limits. She didn't come over to yell. She didn't call me out. She just adapted. And in a way, that was perfect. The message had landed. No confrontation, no shouting match, no lawyer letters, just a quiet, clever rearrangement of their space that made the point far more effectively than any argument ever could. I started noticing subtle changes in Mr. Wilson's behavior too. He would slow down when passing my yard, glance at the corner, and then continue cautiously. He stopped assuming he could make unilateral decisions about shared or disputed spaces. And it struck me, sometimes the best lessons aren't taught with anger. They're taught with intelligence, strategy, and a little creativity. It's a lesson about respect, about boundaries, and about realizing that your actions have consequences, even if you think they won't. Neighbors began commenting too, quietly, in passing. Mrs. Patel across the street waved one afternoon and said, "That corner looks interesting," with a smile that clearly said she knew exactly what had happened. My kids were delighted, running around the yard, helping me place a small new garden ornament just to mess with the Wilsons a little more. It became a community performance, playful yet pointed, where the stakes were small but the satisfaction was enormous. And the best part was, everyone involved learned something without a single shout or complaint, except perhaps from Mr. Wilson muttering under his breath, and that was part of the fun. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch watching the sun cast long shadows across the yard when I realized how much this little battle had taught me. I had thought at first it would be about proving a point, about asserting my rights, about standing up for my property. And it was all of those things, but it was more than that too. It was about patience, about thinking ahead, about solving problems creatively, and about understanding human behavior in miniature theaters like a backyard. Watching Mr. Wilson circle, pausing, recalculating, and then Mrs. Wilson quietly adjusting the chairs, seeing their reactions, gave me a profound sense of satisfaction that went beyond any petty revenge. And then came the moment that really cemented it. Mr. Wilson tried to reclaim a spot for his new grill and immediately ran into the obstacles, the stepping stones, the sandbox, the potted plants perfectly placed. He paused, muttered something unintelligible, and finally, with a resigned sigh, moved the grill to a completely different section of the yard. That pause, that look of mild defeat, was priceless. He didn't have to say it. He didn't even have to look at me. The yard had delivered the message perfectly. And as I sipped my coffee, watching him adjust his plans, I felt the culmination of all my efforts. Cleverness, patience, and subtle intervention had triumphed. By the end of the week, the Wilsons had fully adapted. The corner remained practically unusable, and while they might grumble quietly to each other, they couldn't dispute it, they couldn't undo it, and most importantly, they had learned to respect the boundary. I felt a sense of quiet victory that didn't come from confrontation or drama. It came from doing the right thing with intelligence and a little mischief. And in that sense, it was more satisfying than any shouting match, any legal threat, or any angry exchange could ever have been. But here's the kicker. The story doesn't end neatly. The Wilsons still eye that corner from time to time, clearly wondering if there's a loophole, clearly aware that the space is off limits. And I watch with a quiet amusement, knowing that the lesson is permanent, even if it's delivered subtly. And that's the beauty of it. Sometimes the most effective lessons are the ones you never have to say out loud, the ones that make people realize their mistakes through cleverness and patience. So, what I want to leave you with, the real takeaway, is this: property disputes, small neighborhood conflicts, and petty annoyances. On the surface, they might seem trivial, but they reveal a lot about human behavior, about respect, pride, and boundaries. And the way you respond can make all the difference. You can yell, argue, escalate, or you can get creative, solve the problem subtly, and deliver a lesson that's unforgettable without crossing any lines. Now it's your turn. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor crossing boundaries, taking what wasn't theirs, or assuming the world bends to their convenience? How did you handle it? Did you escalate? Did you compromise? Or did you get clever in a subtle way? Drop your stories in the comments, share your thoughts, and let's have a conversation about respect, boundaries, and creative problem solving. And who knows, maybe next time, one of you will get to execute a little backyard justice of your own, creatively and harmlessly. Because at the end of the day, it's not about winning arguments or shouting the loudest. It's about thinking smart, acting with intention, and maybe, just maybe, turning a frustrating situation into a story that you, your kids, and even the neighbors can laugh about later. And that, to me, is the real victory.